Dozens of Mennonites enjoyed successful careers as artists in the Dutch Republic, and there's plenty of evidence that church members from many different Dutch Mennonite congregations commissioned or collected art for their homes. Throughout the early modern period, artworks based on Bible stories formed an important part of the art genre known as history painting, and artists and collectors from across religious denominations made and collected artworks based on these familiar Bible accounts, Mennonites too. The stories to do with the birth and infancy of Jesus, as recounted in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, found a place within this genre of history painting. Today, I'll review the role of biblical history painting in Dutch visual culture, and I'll highlight some Dutch Mennonite artists who were active in the early modern art world. To keep in the Advent spirit, the artistic examples that I share will all be drawn from among artworks within these artists' oeuvres that represent moments within the biblical Christmas accounts. Happy Advent. Throughout the 17th century, art flourished in the Dutch Republic. There were many different genres of art that people typically collected or commissioned, including history painting, portraits, landscapes, still lifes, and genre pictures of daily life. Most artists opted to specialize in just one of these genres. History painting was considered particularly prestigious, since those who specialized in this needed to be knowledgeable about the stories, capable of devising a pleasing composition to tell the stories, and skilled at painting all sorts of subject matter, including people, still life features, and landscape backgrounds. As Volker Menno and others have shown, the Dutch art scene included artists from various denominations. In general, artist networks transcended religious boundaries. This allowed for the most productive artistic career and the most financial success with a wide base of patrons. Within this multi-confessional art marketplace, artists who were Mennonites worked alongside and in collaboration with artists and patrons who were Dutch Reformed or Catholic or members of other minority groups. So, who were some of these Mennonite artists? The following is not an exhaustive list, but here are a few examples. For discussion on history painting, there are several Mennonite artists we should bring into our consideration. The artist, art theorist, and biographer Carl van Mander was a history painter, though he is now best known as the author of the Schilderboek. With regard to the Nativity theme, his artwork known as Nativity Broadcast by Prophets of the Incarnation has already drawn scholarly attention. The Mennonite minister, artist, and art dealer Lambert Jacobs specialized in Old and New Testament biblical history painting. Here you see a painting by him of the rest during the flight into Egypt. As an aside, his son, Abraham van den Tempel, also became a celebrated portraitist. Hendrik van Eulenberg, who is now particularly well known since he was Rembrandt's art dealer, also produced some biblical history subjects. Here you can see his take on the rest during the flight into Egypt as well. On Rembrandt, here as an aside, I will note that despite the excitement for the idea among 20th century Mennonite historians, including Harold S. Bender and Hans Martin Rotermund, consensus among art historians at present is that Rembrandt was not a Mennonite. Indeed, his direct family members came from Dutch Reformed circles, and he had his children baptized as infants. That being said, Rembrandt is a fascinating focal point for research on art and religion, since he worked with and for people of many different religious groups, including Dutch Reformed, Remonstrants, Mennonites, Catholics, and Jews. And his oeuvre does deal thoughtfully and extensively in biblical history subjects, which were meant to appeal to a broadly Christian Dutch art marketplace. He and his circle remain fascinating for the study of Mennonite involvement in art, primarily since many of his peers, pupils, and patrons during the first decades of his work in Amsterdam were Mennonite. Two examples include painters Govert Flink and Jacob Adriaans Bakkers, who first studied together with Jacobs in Leeuwarden before moving to Amsterdam. Both were from Mennonite families. Flink, who went on to study with Rembrandt, eventually got baptized as an adult among the Remonstrants. Bakker, who was not a pupil of Rembrandt, but was a peer in contact with him and his circles, also joined the Remonstrants. Both of these artists excelled in history painting. Here, as one example, you can see Flink's treatment of the angels appearing to the shepherds. The sky is ablaze with angels, while below, shepherds gaze up and recoil in shock. One shepherd, who has not quite yet woken up, is in for a surprise. Another important connection here is artist and art theorist Samuel van Hoogstraten. He was son of the Mennonite artist Dirk van Hoogstraten and came from a family in Dordrecht which included many writers and artists. He is now best known since he studied with Rembrandt and since he published one of the significant art theory works of the early modern period, his Introduction to the Academy of Painting, or Zichtbare Wereld. Van Hoogstraten did some history painting and also specialized in illusionistic still lifes and perspective scenes. Though Samuel chose to get baptized in the Mennonite congregation, he was eventually excommunicated after marrying a non-Mennonite. Both father and son painted scenes of adoration connected to the Nativity story. Here, you can see Dirk van Hoogstraten's painting of the Adoration of the Magi. The plain garb of the Holy Family and the humble surroundings of the stable contrast starkly with the opulent dress of the visiting wise men from the East and the rest of their entourage. And here, you can see Samuel van Hoogstraten's treatment of the adoration theme. Rembrandt's influence in style and color palette is evident. And do you notice that the viewers are wearing typical 17th century Dutch clothing rather than historiated dress? Since the center of attention is the Holy Family, cast in light by the nearby fire and a lantern, and since there are angels, subtle but visible, in the top center of the scene, it is nonetheless clear that this is to be interpreted as the biblical nativity scene. Also of import, as artist and writer, is Van Hoogstraten's pupil, Arnold Houbraken, who was also a member of the same Dordrecht Mennonite congregation for his early life, though he eventually married in the Dutch Reformed Church and increasingly moved in circles of heterodox early Enlightenment thinkers. He produced some history painting, but is now best known for his 3-volume set of artist biographies, the Grote Schouwburg. Several Mennonites also specialized in printmaking, or did this in addition to painting, and illustrations of biblical stories were also a common subject in this medium, appearing as individual prints and for illustrations in history volumes and devotional publications of various sorts. The Mennonite Van de Passe family was an important multi-generational family of printmakers, for example. Here you can see Crispijn van de Passe the Elder's own composition featuring the visitation of Mary to her cousin Elizabeth when they were both pregnant. He also reproduced other artists' compositions with skill. For instance, you can see here his engraving after Johann Rottenhammer's rest on the flight into Egypt. In this scene, you can see the Holy Family resting idyllically in the foreground, but the timeline of the story is conflated, so that in the background at the right, you can also see the family fleeing through the countryside. And of course, we mustn't forget the prolific printmaker Jan Luyken, who illustrated the 1685 Martyr's Mirror. He also illustrated all sorts of books of other sorts, including many histories and other volumes featuring biblical history subjects, and thus these nativity stories were also a part of his repertoire. Here, for example, You can see Mary, Joseph, and Jesus in the foreground, with angels looking on from on high. In the background, if you look carefully, you can also see the angel's appearance to the shocked shepherds. This was one of a set of 20 prints, and it appeared in several New Testament accounts published in the 17th and 18th century. Biblical stories also found a place in volumes of other sorts. For example, this illustration by Arnold Houbraken features the story of the massacre of the innocents under the order of Herod as part of Lambert van den Bos's volume Toneel der Ongevallen, about the miseries of worldly powers. While history painting is our focus today, I will also note that many other artists who were Mennonites were active in other genres. Important examples include the court portraitist Michiel van Meervelt, the inventor and cityscape painter Jan van der Heyden, landscape painters among the Rousdale family, still life painter and Frans Hals pupil Vincent Laurens van de Vinne, as well as the subsequent generations of his family, and church interior painter Isaac van Nicolin, as well as the next generations of his family, to name just a few. We've now looked at some key Mennonite artists and their contributions. But how does this all fit into the genre of Dutch biblical history illustration more broadly, and into the longer history of the treatment of the Christmas story in art? Let's take a closer look. The story of Jesus' birth and infancy has found a place in Christian art for centuries. In your mind's eye, or with the help of Google, you might imagine aspects of the Christmas story depicted in all sorts of media and many different regions. Early Roman reliefs, Byzantine wall art, medieval wood carving and paintings, frescoes, southern and northern religious paintings and prints, and more. You might think of artworks like Giotto's scene of the flight into Egypt, or Fra Angelico's Annunciation. Perhaps Baroque examples spring to mind, nativity scenes by Rubens and Van Dyck, or indeed the treatments of many of these Christmas-related stories by Rembrandt and his followers. And of course, there are the many examples that we just looked at together. Over time, several key moments from the nativity accounts emerged as the most typical scenes for artistic depiction. These were themes like the Annunciation, the visitation of Mary to Elizabeth, the announcement of the angels to the shepherds, the Holy Family in Bethlehem, the adoration of the shepherds, the adoration of the Magi, Joseph's dream, the flight into Egypt, and the terrible story of King Herod and the massacre of the innocents. These stories were well known and a part of Christian mainstream visual culture. Fluency with this story content was a two-way street. On the one hand, the story's familiarity was reinforced by the art, especially in times before widespread literacy. And on the other, the art was recognizable and popular since the stories were familiar. In medieval and Catholic Renaissance tradition, artwork including these and other biblical themes found an important place within the church itself, for example, in large and resplendent altarpieces. After the Reformation, Catholic churches continued to have a place for these nativity stories alongside other biblical stories in their church altarpieces. Meanwhile, most groups that split away from the Catholic Church were concerned about image use in worship, and so the place for biblical subjects in art moved from the church into the sphere of the home. In the Dutch Republic, biblical stories in art remained popular subjects. In the Protestant mindset, as didactic or moralizing history works, rather than icons or objects to be revered, biblical subjects on display in the home were understood to be edifying themes for all. Mennonites, like the Dutch Reformed and others, made and collected biblical history illustrations, as well as art of various other genres. These served as decoration and as conversation pieces, as sources of enjoyment and as objects that presented good lessons through the representation of biblical models of faithfulness. Early modern devotional literature also featured different kinds of emblems, history illustrations, and representations of biblical stories. As Piet Visser and others have extensively demonstrated in research on book history and print culture, many Dutch Mennonite authors and artists were involved in book production as writers, illustrators, or publishers. The final products, including poetry, emblem books, histories, and other volumes, were read and appreciated by all sorts of readers, including their Mennonite co-religionists, but not exclusively so. Sometimes there were instances of Mennonite authors, illustrators, and publishers teaming up to produce a publication. There is plenty of evidence of robust Mennonite networks here. And to be sure, there was devotional and apologetical writing that was intended to be strongly confessional. But in many publications from the age, we also get to see how flexible illustration and publication work could be. There were collaborations across religious boundaries, and for certain book genres, there was frequent repurposing of pre-existing biblical illustrations that had been made by a variety of artists and used in different sources. Whether as paintings on the wall or prints within books, Bible stories were a familiar part of visual culture of the age, and among these, the stories of Jesus' birth. Mennonites of the Dutch Republic partook of this visual culture and participated in its production. As we continue in this Advent season, I leave you now with a chance to reflect upon some of the images we have looked at today at a more leisurely pace. Feel free to study each of them, find and read the corresponding texts from Matthew or Luke, and consider how the artists have interpreted each story. Thank you for joining me today. This was Mennonites and Art in the Dutch Republic, Advent Edition.